Amaka and Zuri grew up like twins even though they weren't. They shared clothes, secrets, and dreams about the future. Everyone in their small town called them the Golden Sisters because they were always together, laughing, helping their parents, and believing nothing could come between them. But things changed when Zuri met Tanashi. He was smooth, rich, and loved showing off. He drove flashy cars, wore gold watches, and promised Zuri the world. When they got married, Zuri changed almost overnight. First, Amaka was happy for her. She even helped plan the wedding, smiling through tears as her sister walked down the aisle in diamonds. But soon Zuri started acting different, colder. She began talking down to Amaka, calling her too simple or too slow to dream big. At family gatherings, she'd laugh loudly and say things like, "Some of us marry men, not dreams," whenever someone mentioned Amaka's long nursing shifts. Amaka didn't fight back. She just smiled and kept doing what she'd always done, working long hours at the hospital, sending money home to their aging parents, and praying her sister would find her way back. But deep down she could feel it. Something dark was brewing behind Zuri's shiny new life. The sparkle in her sister's eyes wasn't happiness anymore. It was pride, and pride, Amaka knew, had a way of turning gold into dust. Zuri and Tanashi were living like royalty. Their new mansion sat on a hill with a golden gate that sparkled under the sun. Expensive cars lined the driveway, and every weekend there was a new party, champagne fountains, designer clothes, and people trying too hard to impress. Zuri had become the center of attention everywhere she went. She posted pictures online every day, luxury dinners, poolside selfies, her diamond bracelets glistening. Her captions were always loud and proud, "Marry rich or die trying." Thousands of likes, hundreds of comments, and Zuri loved every second of it. Meanwhile, Amaka stayed grounded. She worked double shifts at the hospital and sometimes dropped by the mansion just to check on her sister. But each time she visited, she felt more like a stranger. Zuri would glance at her plain clothes and cheap shoes with a smirk. "You wouldn't understand the life of wealth," she'd say, sipping champagne like she was in a movie. Amaka would just smile politely, pretending not to notice the judgment in her sister's tone. At dinner parties, Zuri made sure everyone knew who was rich and who wasn't. She'd laugh with her friends about people who worked for a living, forgetting that her own sister was one of them. The more she flaunted, the more distant she became, not just from Amaka, but from reality. But Amaka noticed something Zuri thought no one could see. Behind the perfect makeup and designer clothes, her sister's eyes looked tired, sometimes afraid. When everyone was laughing and drinking, Zuri would glance around the room like she was waiting for something or someone. Once, when Tanashi took a phone call outside, her smile faded instantly. She gripped her glass so tightly it almost broke. "Are you okay?" Amaka asked softly. "I'm fine," Zuri snapped, forcing another smile. "Enjoy the party, sis." But Amaka couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The laughter in that mansion felt hollow, like it was hiding something ugly underneath. She saw how Tanashi's friends whispered in corners, how his phone never stopped ringing, and how Zuri flinched every time his voice grew sharp. That night, as Amaka drove away in her small second-hand car, she glanced in the rearview mirror. The mansion lights were glowing bright, but to her, it didn't look like a home anymore. It looked like a golden cage, beautiful on the outside but full of fear on the inside. And while the world believed Zuri was living her best life, Amaka knew the truth. Her sister's smile wasn't made of joy. It was made of pressure, and sooner or later something was going to crack. Months passed, and the sparkle around Zuri and Tanashi's perfect life started to fade. People in town began whispering that Tanashi's business was falling apart. The big contracts he bragged about, they never existed. The luxury cars, all bought on credit, and the so-called investors everyone thought were businessmen, were actually loan sharks. Amaka tried to ignore the rumors at first. She didn't want to believe her sister's dream life was built on lies. But then small things started showing. The fancy parties stopped, Zuri's social media went quiet, and when Amaka visited one weekend, the mansion that once buzzed with guests felt cold and empty. "Zuri, is everything okay?" Amaka asked gently as they sat in the silent living room. Zuri snapped her head up, irritation flashing in her eyes. Mind your poor business, Amaka. Not everyone lives for hospital shifts and grocery coupons. The words cut deep, but Amaka didn't argue. She could tell the anger came from fear, not pride. There were dark circles under Zuri's eyes, unopened bills stacked on the counter, and Tinashe's phone kept ringing non-stop. He never answered in front of her. That night, Amaka couldn't sleep. Something didn't feel right. Around midnight, her phone buzzed. It was Zuri's number. But when she answered, it wasn't Zuri's voice. A low, rough voice said, "Tell your sister to pay what she owes. Next time we won't be polite." Then the line went dead. Amaka's heart pounded so hard she could barely breathe. She called Zuri immediately, but her sister didn't pick up. Panic rushed through her veins. She spent the rest of the night pacing her small living room, praying her sister was safe. The next morning she finally reached Zuri, who laughed it off like it was nothing. "People talk nonsense when they're jealous," she said quickly. "Don't believe everything you hear." But Amaka could hear the tremble in her voice. Days later, when she went to drop off groceries at their parents' house, her mother whispered, "Your sister hasn't visited in weeks. I heard men came to the gate asking for Tinashe." Amaka's stomach turned. She realized the danger was real, and much closer than Zuri wanted to admit. That night, when she sat alone after work, her phone sat on the table like a ticking bomb. Every ring made her heart jump. She had always thought trouble stayed far from her quiet life, but now it was crossing her doorstep. For the first time, fear truly entered Amaka's home. And deep down, she knew it wasn't just Zuri's world that was cracking. It was the bond they once thought nothing could break. The fall came faster than anyone expected. One bright morning, flashing police lights surrounded Zuri's mansion. Neighbors peeked from their windows as officers marched through the golden gate that once screamed wealth. Cars were towed, jewelry boxes emptied, and expensive paintings taken off the walls. Everything Zuri had proudly shown off was gone in hours. The house that once smelled of champagne and perfume now echoed with silence and shame. Tinashe was handcuffed right in front of the gate, cameras flashing as reporters shouted his name. "Fraud," they said. "Fake investments. Stolen money." Zuri tried to speak, but her voice cracked under the weight of humiliation. Her friends, the same ones who had once crowded her mansion for parties, disappeared like smoke. No one called. No one answered her messages. Her phone, once full of praise and attention, became a device of silence. By nightfall she had nowhere to go. The mansion was locked, her cards were frozen, and her fancy clothes suddenly meant nothing. She packed what she could, a few wrinkled dresses, her wedding photo, and a torn handbag. Then, with shaking hands, she took a bus to the only place left, Amaka's small old apartment at the edge of town. When Amaka opened the door, she froze. Her proud, elegant sister was standing there, eyes red, mascara streaked down her face. The woman who once mocked her for living small was now clutching a bag of nothing. "Amaka, please," Zuri whispered, her voice breaking. "I thought money meant safety. I thought I had everything." Amaka stared for a long moment, remembering all the insults, the laughter, the times Zuri turned her back. Part of her wanted to close the door and protect her peace. But then she saw it, the fear in Zuri's eyes, the kind that no diamond could hide. She sighed softly and stepped aside. "Now," she said quietly, "you'll learn what wealth really means." Zuri broke down in tears, her sobs echoing through the small apartment. Amaka helped her inside, offering her a warm blanket and a glass of water. There was no judgment, no anger, just quiet compassion. As Zuri sat on the worn couch, she looked around the tiny space. There were no chandeliers or designer furniture, just peace. A pot of soup simmered on the stove, and family photos lined the wall. For the first time in years, she felt something she hadn't felt in all her luxury: safety. And as Amaka covered her with the blanket, Zuri whispered through her tears, "I had everything except love." Amaka didn't reply. She simply sat beside her, holding her hand. Because sometimes, the richest lessons are learned after you've lost everything money can buy. Life in Amaka's small house was nothing like what Zuri was used to. There was no marble floor, no warm bath waiting, and no maid calling her madam. The first morning, she woke up shivering because there was no hot water. She frowned at the small breakfast, a cup of tea and 2 slices of bread. "Is this it?" she asked quietly. Amaka just smiled. "Yes, it's simple, but it's enough." Zuri wasn't used to silence either. No loud music, no guests gossiping, no champagne glasses clinking. The quietness made her restless. She missed her fancy life, or maybe just the noise that helped her ignore how empty it really was. She complained about almost everything: the old couch, the small meals, even the way Amaka prayed before dinner. But Amaka never argued. She'd just go to work, come home tired, and still make sure her sister had food to eat and a place to rest. One evening, Zuri followed Amaka to the clinic where she worked. She watched as her sister gently treated an old woman who couldn't afford medicine. Amaka used her own lunch money to buy her painkillers. When the woman thanked her, Amaka smiled and said, "You don't need to thank me, this is what family does." That night, Zuri couldn't sleep. Her mind kept replaying that scene, her sister giving when she barely had enough for herself. A few days later, there was a loud knock at the door. A rough-looking man stood outside. "We're looking for Zuri Tanashi," he said. "Tell her she owes people money." Zuri froze in fear, her hands trembling. Before she could speak, Amaka stepped forward and said calmly, "She's my sister. We'll pay what we can." The man frowned, then walked away, muttering something under his breath. Zuri sat down, tears filling her eyes. "Why did you say that? You don't owe them anything," she cried. Amaka looked at her softly. "Because family doesn't abandon each other when it's hard. You stood tall when you had money. Now I'll stand for you when you have none." Zuri broke down completely. The weight of everything, the pride, the arrogance, the mistakes, came crashing down. She hugged her sister tightly and sobbed, "I was so blind. I thought love was expensive gifts and luxury dinners. But it was you all along." Amaka just held her, rubbing her back gently. "Now you know," she whispered. "Real wealth isn't what you wear. It's who stands beside you when everything else disappears." That night, for the first time in years, Zuri prayed. Not for money, not for fame, but for forgiveness, and for the strength to become more like her sister. Slowly, life began to settle again, not in luxury but in peace. Amaka refused to let her sister drown in regret. "You can start over," she said one morning as they sat by the small kitchen table. "It's not too late." Zuri looked doubtful. "Start over with what, Amaka? I've lost everything." But Amaka smiled gently. "Then it means you have nothing left to lose. That's freedom." A week later, Amaka took Zuri to a women's cooperative in town, a small group that helped widows and single mothers earn a living. The room smelled of fabric and determination. Women sat behind sewing machines, chatting and laughing as they worked. Amaka introduced her sister to Mama Chica, the group leader. "She can sew a little," Amaka said. Zuri blushed. "I used to pay people to do this," she admitted softly. Mama Chica chuckled. "Then it's time you learn to pay yourself, with skill." First it was hard. Zuri pricked her fingers, struggled to thread needles, and ruined more fabric than she finished. She wanted to quit 100 times. But every evening, Amaka would sit beside her, encouraging her to try again. "You learned to live rich," she'd say with a grin. "Now learn to live real." Days turned into weeks, and slowly, Zuri began to change. Her hands grew steady, her posture more confident. She started stitching uniforms for school children and small dresses for the market. When she got her first payment, just a few coins, she cried. Not because it was small but because it was hers. She bought a small glass jar and began saving every coin, whispering, "Step by step." People in town whispered too. They'd pass her little stall and say, "Isn't that the woman who used to wear diamonds? The one who drove that big car?" Some laughed, others pitied her. But Zuri didn't care anymore. She'd just smile softly and say, "And this is peace." One afternoon as she worked, a young girl came by to pick up her school uniform. The child looked shy and said, "My mama said thank you. She couldn't afford it, but your sister paid half." Zuri froze and turned to Amaka, who just smiled from across the room. Tears welled up in Zuri's eyes. She finally understood what her sister had been trying to teach her, that giving doesn't come from abundance, it comes from love. That night, as the two sisters shared a simple meal, Zuri looked at Amaka and said, "You know, I used to think strength was shouting loud enough for people to notice. But it's actually the quiet kind, the kind that keeps showing up even when no one claps." Amaka reached across the table and held her hand. "Now you understand," she said softly. And for the first time in a long, long while, Zuri didn't feel broken, she felt whole. Years passed, and the sisters' lives looked completely different, simple, calm, and full of meaning. Amaka's dream finally came true. She opened a small community clinic in their town. It wasn't fancy, but it was full of heart. The walls were painted bright yellow, the waiting benches were always full, and everyone in the neighborhood called it the House of Healing. Amaka didn't have big donors or sponsors, just honest work, compassion, and the support of people who believed in her. She treated patients who couldn't pay, helped mothers deliver babies safely, and trained young nurses who wanted to serve their community. Every evening when she locked up, she'd find Zuri waiting outside, smiling and holding 2 cups of tea. Zuri had changed completely. She now worked beside her sister, managing the cooperative's tailoring unit and sewing uniforms for the clinic staff. The woman who once measured her worth in gold now measured it in peace. Her laughter was softer, her words kinder, and her eyes, once filled with pride, now shone with gratitude. Tinashe's name slowly disappeared from the news. The stories about his fraud and trial faded, and people stopped mentioning him. No one knew where he went, and Zuri never asked. She had made peace with her past. The mansion, the diamonds, the fake friends. All of it felt like another lifetime. One afternoon, a journalist visited the clinic to write a feature on Amaka's work. After taking photos and interviewing patients, she turned to Zuri, surprised. "Wait," she said. "You're that Zuri Tinashe, aren't you? The one who used to live in that big house." Zuri laughed softly, not with embarrassment but with peace. "Yes," she said. "That was me, or at least who I thought I was." The journalist tilted her head. "Do you ever miss that life? The luxury, the attention, the power?" Zuri looked around the clinic, at the children running in the hallway, at Amaka checking on an elderly patient, at the walls covered in thank you notes written in crayons. Then she smiled. "I was a queen without peace," she said gently. "Now I'm free, and that's richer." The journalist's eyes softened. "That's beautiful," she whispered. Later that evening, when the article came out, people all over town read it and couldn't believe how much Zuri had changed. Some came to the clinic just to see her, the once proud woman who had lost everything but found herself. As the sun set that night, Amaka and Zuri sat outside the clinic, sipping tea and watching children play. "You know," Amaka said, "life really turned the tables, didn't it?" Zuri smiled. "Yes," she whispered, "but this time the table is set with peace." And for the first time, both sisters felt truly rich, not in gold but in grace. The hall was packed with women from every walk of life, students, widows, business owners, and mothers trying to start over. It was the annual Women's Empowerment Seminar, and this year Amaka had been invited to speak. She stood on stage in a simple blue dress, her calm presence filling the room. Zuri sat quietly in the front row, her heart swelling with pride and nerves. She had no idea what her sister was going to say. When Amaka took the microphone, she smiled warmly and began, "I'm not here as a celebrity or a doctor. I'm here as a sister, one who fell and one who stood beside her." The room grew silent. Everyone leaned forward as she continued, telling their story, not with anger, not with pity, but with truth. She spoke about how success had once divided them, how pride had blinded one sister while humility strengthened the other. She didn't hide the mistakes, but she also didn't point fingers. "My sister once had gold," Amaka said softly, "and I had grit. But today we both have grace." The crowd erupted into applause. Women wiped tears from their eyes. Some stood, clapping with emotion. They weren't just hearing a story, they were seeing hope. Amaka wasn't preaching. She was reminding them that even broken lives can be rebuilt with love and forgiveness. Backstage, Zuri couldn't hold back her tears. When Amaka came down from the stage, Zuri ran to her and hugged her tightly. Her voice shook as she whispered, "You didn't shame me, you saved me." Amaka smiled, brushing away her sister's tears. "You saved yourself, Zuri. You just needed to remember who you were." That night, as they walked home under the streetlights, they talked about all the women they had met, those struggling to feed their kids, those trying to rebuild after betrayal or loss. "We can help them," Zuri said suddenly. "We've lived it. We understand." And that's how the Real Rich Foundation was born, an organization built not from money, but from experience and compassion. They started small, teaching widows and jobless women how to sew, manage small businesses and save money. Zuri handled the training, while Amaka offered free health checks and emotional support. Word spread quickly. Soon women from nearby towns came to learn, laugh, and heal. Every Friday, Zuri would stand in front of the group and say, "You don't need diamonds to shine. You just need purpose." Months later, a journalist asked Amaka what real rich meant. She smiled and replied, "Real richness isn't about what's in your bank, it's about what's in your heart." And as the foundation grew, so did the bond between the sisters. They had lost everything money could buy but gained everything that truly mattered: love, peace, and a purpose that made others rise too. One sunny afternoon, Zuri sat at her small wooden desk, surrounded by piles of fabric and laughter from the women learning to sew in her workshop. Her phone buzzed with a message. When she saw the name, Lorato, her heart skipped. It was the same woman who used to mock Amaka, who once said, "Your sister's too poor to sit with us." Zuri opened the message slowly. "Zuri, I need help. My husband left, the business collapsed, and the bank is calling every day. Please, just a small loan. I'll pay you back." Zuri read it twice, her chest heavy with memories. Once upon a time she would have rushed to help, desperate for approval, afraid of losing status. But now she had learned the value of boundaries, the dignity of honest work, and the peace of self-respect. She typed back gently, "Lorato, I don't lend money anymore. I teach women how to earn it." Then she added a small heart emoji and sent it. Within minutes, the message spread across social media. Screenshots, shares, comments, everywhere people were talking. "This is the Zuri who lost everything but came back stronger." Women began tagging her, writing things like, "Teach me how to earn too," and "This message healed my pride." Zuri didn't expect it to go viral, but something about the truth in her words, kind, firm, and wise, touched hearts. Reporters began calling her the graceful rebuilder. People started inviting her to speak at schools, markets, and churches about financial independence. Meanwhile, Lorato saw the post too. First she felt embarrassed, but after a while she wrote again, "You were right. I want to learn." Zuri smiled, walking to Amaka's small garden where the flowers were in full bloom. "Do you remember Lorato?" she asked her sister, watering the plants. "She wants to join the program." Amaka laughed softly. "Karma's not cruel, Zuri. It just teaches lessons the way we can understand them." Zuri nodded, her heart full. "I used to think karma was revenge," she said. "Now I see it's just balance." Months later, Zuri watched as Lorato sat among the new women in the sewing class. Quiet, humble, learning to stitch her first fabric. No diamonds, no designer bags. Just focus, hope, and gratitude. By then, even the debt collectors had stopped calling Zuri. She had paid off every cent she owed, not in fear or shame, but in honor. She earned her freedom with dignity. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Zuri whispered to herself, "I was once rich in pride and poor in peace. Now I'm rich in purpose, and that's worth more than gold." And somewhere deep in her heart, she knew karma had finally finished its circle, not as punishment but as grace. The studio lights were bright, and the audience sat in complete silence as Zuri faced the camera. Her voice was calm but full of emotion. "Riches fade," she said softly, "but character stays. My sister was poor in money, but rich in grace, and that's the only wealth that truly saved me." There was a long pause. You could feel every word land in the hearts of the people watching, both in the studio and at home. The same woman who once showed off luxury cars and diamond rings was now glowing in simple clothes. her piece shining brighter than any jewel. The host smiled and said, "And where is this amazing sister of yours today?" Right then the side door opened, and Amaka walked in, wearing her white nurse's uniform. The crowd gasped and began clapping. Zuri stood up instantly, tears filling her eyes. The two sisters hugged tightly in front of everyone. No pride, no shame, just love and forgiveness. The cameras zoomed in as Amaka whispered, "You made me proud, Zuri." Zuri smiled through her tears. "No, big sister. You made me whole." The audience stood up, cheering and crying at the same time. It was a moment no one would forget, two sisters who had lost everything but found themselves again through grace. And as the camera panned out, their hands stayed locked together. Karma hadn't come in anger this time. It came gently, wrapped in humility, glowing with forgiveness, and wearing peace like a crown.